You're watching France 24, the main news headlines for you. Hong Kong's protest groups vow new rallies, despite the territory's leader saying the extradition bill that has sparked Hong Kong's biggest crisis in decades is dead. Carrie Lam admitting the government's work on the bill has been a total failure. We'll hear from our correspondent Sean Pellegrin shortly. The British government continues to insist the UK ambassador to the US has its full support. That despite Donald Trump saying the US will no longer work with him after he described Trump as inept and his White House as uniquely dysfunctional. And today, the day that Algeria's interim transition period officially comes to an end after the ouster of President Abdelaziz Bouteflika. What next? Unclear, as protesters continue to demand all of the old regime quit power. I'll speak to our correspondent in Tunis very shortly. It is the bill that has sparked Hong Kong's biggest political crisis in decades. But now Hong Kong's leader Carrie Lam has announced that it is officially dead, as she admitted the government's work on the extradition bill there has been a total failure. The bill, which would have allowed people in Hong Kong to be sent to mainland China to face trial, sparking huge and at times violent protests and plunging the former British colony into turmoil. Well, let's hear first exactly what Lam had to say.
The cause of all these grievances and confrontations is an exercise to amend the Fugitive Offenders Ordinance. I have almost immediately put a stop to the amendment exercise. But there are still lingering doubts about the government's sincerity or worries whether the government will restart the process in the Legislative Council. So I reiterate here, there is no such plan. The bill is dead.
Well, demonstrators, though, are already rejecting Lam's proposal, saying their demands have not been met.
The extradition bill being put in the Legislative Council is a very legal, very formal legal proceeding. However, she only said that the bill is dead. We cannot find the word dead in any of the laws in Hong Kong or any legal proceedings in the Legislative Council. So how can the government tell us that we should preserve our rule of law when she herself do not use the rule of law?
Well, a little earlier, I spoke to our correspondent, Sean Pellegrin, in Beijing. He's covered the protest for us in Hong Kong. He told me Lam's announcement really unlikely to appease many of the protesters.
Protesters will not be satisfied with this particular statement, first of all, because it's still not clear enough for them, and also because now their movement has become about much more than just the extradition bill. Recent protests have been about demanding democratic reform in the semi-autonomous territory of Hong Kong, and as we saw over last Sunday, the most recent protest that tried to bring attention to these issues to even mainland Chinese people, mainland tourists who were in Hong Kong, in Kowloon doing shopping. So really, this bill will not really satisfy the protesters who are demanding so much more from Carrie Lam, including the fact that she stepped down and including the fact that they want a top-level judicial inquiry in police brutality, especially for the June 12th protest. And this Monday, Carrie Lam did not give such assurances.
Sean Pellegrin there in Beijing. Now, unfair, ineffective and very, very expensive. That's the description by the US President Donald Trump of the Paris Climate Change Accord as he gave a major speech on America's environmental leadership. In front, Trump making a speech without even mentioning climate change at all. Critics then seeing the speech as an attempt at greenwashing the president's image ahead of the 2020 election, in which climate change is set to be a key issue. Alison Sargent reports.
We have only one America. We have only one planet.
It's a new role for the U.S. president, environmental champion. Still, Donald Trump sounded familiar as he praised what he called America's environmental leadership, slamming the Paris Climate Agreement as unfair, emphasizing the importance of the economy, ignoring climate change, and touting America's air and water.
From day one, my administration has made it a top priority to ensure that America is among the very cleanest air and cleanest water on the planet. We want the cleanest air. We want crystal clean water.
From day one, the Trump administration also made it crystal clear that a top priority is to roll back environmental regulations. Just months after he entered office, Donald Trump signed an executive order unraveling the Obama-era Clean Power Plan and announced the U.S. pullout from the Paris Agreement. The president also appointed a climate change skeptic and former coal and oil lobbyists to lead the Environmental Protection Agency. Donald Trump himself has called climate change an expensive hoax, but the issue is becoming an increasing concern for the public. And a recent poll found that just 29% of U.S. voters approve of the Trump administration's handling of climate change, making the environment one of the president's weakest points as he fights for re-election in 2020. Donald Trump's environment speech came just hours after the U.S. Capitol saw record rainfall, which flooded streets and seeped into the White House basement, an example of the extreme weather that scientists say is linked to climate change.
Now, the ambassador continues to have the Prime Minister's full support, continues to say the British government, we will no longer deal with him, says Donald Trump in a tweet. The standoff then between the two sides after leaked mails in which the British ambassador to the US described the president as inept and his White House as uniquely dysfunctional. Trump also hitting out in his tweets against Theresa May, saying she had created the mess over Brexit. Well, earlier I spoke to our White House correspondent, Philip Crowther. I put it to him that this is rather a falling apart of the seams of the diplomatic relationship between the US and the UK.
The position of ambassador very much in question now because Ambassador Kim Darroch, a very popular diplomat here in Washington, his position is very much now in question. He serves at the pleasure of the host country, meaning the United States. Now, what we don't know at this point, because as is so often the case, what we have from the U.S. president is just a tweet. He says he won't deal with Kim Darroch, the British ambassador, any longer. Now, is that just the president himself or the whole administration? If it is the whole administration, including the State Department, you can't really see a position for this specific British ambassador, for Kim Darroch, really existing here in Washington. At the end of the day, what he did, though, is something that every single ambassador anywhere around the world does. He gave his frank opinion of what is happening in the White House, his opinion of the U.S. president, and one that many other ambassadors and governments definitely share. As you said, the words used by him, inept, dysfunctional, that is not necessarily something that even some members of the inner circle of Donald Trump would disapprove of.
Philip, Trump also critical of Theresa May in tweets, but pretty supportive of the Queen.
Pretty much all that's left for the president because that was a state visit just a few weeks ago where there was praise for the Queen, of course. The president liked that state visit. He likes the pomp and circumstance. At the time, also, remember, he had praise for the British Prime Minister Theresa May, but that has all gone out of the window. This is a major embarrassment for her in her final days, most likely, of course, as Prime Minister. And, of course, she has a job on her hands now, or at least the British government does, and also the embassy here in Washington. They need to find out how this leak actually happened, because it's really difficult to see how anybody in this spat really has anything to gain, except maybe those who might come into positions of power in the British government very soon. If the next Prime Minister is to be Boris Johnson, well, he might get the chance to decide who might be his ambassador in Washington. And remember this, there has been a lot of praise from US President Trump for Boris Johnson in the past. There has also been a lot of praise from him for one of the Brexit leaders, Nigel Farage. The president in the past has said he would like to see him here as an ambassador. It's something that might just happen, but certainly not necessarily the whole diplomatic relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom in question right now, but certainly any diplomatic relationship that the British embassy might have established here in Washington.
Philip Crowther in Washington there. Now, dozens of influential Afghans have concluded 2 days of talks with the Taliban in Doha, laying the foundations for renewed negotiations between the United States and the militants. The encounter ending with a joint statement pledging a roadmap for peace based on the opening of a monitored peace process, return of internally displaced people and non-interference by regional powers in Afghanistan. Also featured in that joint text, assuring women's rights in political, social, economic, educational and cultural affairs. Now today, a crucial day in Algeria. It is the day that months after the former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika stepped down under intense pressure and demonstrations, that the country's transition period officially comes to an end. Now the interim president, Abdelkader Ben Salah, the former Speaker of the Upper House, constitutionally due to stay in his post only until today. We'll bring across live then to Algiers, speak to our correspondent Monsef Ayakaki, who joins us from there. Monsef, do you actually expect anything to change in the country there today?
Maybe yes, because the people will reject Abdelkader Ben Salah as acting president, because Abdelkader Ben Salah's interim as head of state since April 9 reaches this Tuesday, as you just said it, the constitutional deadline of its expiry, and Algeria could find itself, to say the least, in a new situation. Until then, the holding of the office of interim president for a period of 90 days in place of the president declared unfit was well protected by Article 102 of the Algerian Constitution. During these 3 months, a presidential election was supposed to be held, but it was cancelled. So the result, 3 months later, Algeria is without a president of the republic, and Abdelkader Ben Salah can no longer claim constitutionally, at least, the status of head of state. It can be expected that total illegality will be denounced. I would point out that the Constitutional Council has already taken the lead for over a month now by issuing a decision which extends de facto the acting of the current head of state until the holding of the presidential election and the swearing of the new president of Algeria. But the reaction will probably be negative from today.
And Monsef, protesters, meanwhile, they're still calling, aren't they, for all of the old regime to be no longer involved in running the country?
Among protesters, there are students who will take to the streets this Tuesday for the 20th Tuesday of protests. So probably they will talk about this act of today. An announcement could be made or retreated today to refresh memories by the government. At least that is the possible outcome of power against the backdrop of popular pressure that calls for the departure of the entire system in place. But this decision could be condemned by some lawyers or even students today, because lawyers have not hesitated to call it a coup. So the question we have to ask today is not what the government is planning. It's more about how the decisions that will be made starting on July 9 today by Abdelkader Ben Salah and all the members of the state will be welcomed by the people. Probably we will know more later in the street.
Monsef, thanks very much. Monsef Ayakaki, correspondent, speaking to us live there from Algiers. Now, Italy's hardline Interior Minister Matteo Salvini is set to attend today closure of Europe's one-time biggest asylum seeker reception centre. It comes just a day after Pope Francis said that no one is exempt from helping migrants, in an indirect rebuke of Salvini, who's tried to shut the country's ports to non-governmental migrant rescue ships. Peter O'Brien reports.
Cara de Mineo in Sicily is more like a town than a refugee centre and was once Italy's biggest, with more than 4,000 asylum seekers. On Tuesday, it's officially closing, and reaction among the locals is mixed.
Now the families of 400 employees here will have no income left.
I'm not prejudiced against migrants, but with 4,000 people, it was becoming unmanageable.
Since the height of the migratory movement 4 years ago, the centre's numbers have dropped to around 1,000. But after reports of criminal activity and mismanagement, Interior Minister Matteo Salvini announced its closure, and he'll be there on Tuesday to oversee it. Salvini, leader of the far-right League Party, has implemented hardline anti-immigration policies, a law stripping humanitarian protection for migrants not approved for refugee status, more camp closures, and a ban on charity boats carrying migrants from entering Italian ports. Last month, the captain of aid ship Sea-Watch, Carola Raketa, was arrested after defying the blockade, sailing into port with dozens of rescued migrants. She was freed by a judge, angering Salvini, but still faces people smuggling charges. Another in defiance, Pope Francis, who's repeatedly advocated welcoming migrants. On Monday, he said no one is exempt from helping them, in what appeared to be a rebuke to Salvini.
Peter O'Brien there. Now, it's a decade, would you believe, since Snowball, the sulphur-crested cockatoo, revealed his first dance moves and became an instant worldwide sensation. You remember, don't you? Let's have a look. This is Snowball, first emerged for his remarkable ability to rock out to the Backstreet Boys and Cyndi Lauper, and now our feathered friend is back, having learnt a dizzying array of new moves, apparently. New study pointing to the bird at the peak of his creative powers. Snowball pulls 14 distinct moves. Psychologists saying it appears if you have a brain with certain capabilities, you're simply predisposed to dance. He is pretty impressive, isn't he? Obviously, I don't have that kind of brain because I'm not going to dance for you now. Instead, I'm going to bring you the news headlines on Live from Paris. Hong Kong's protest groups vowing new rallies despite the territory's leader saying the extradition bill that has sparked Hong Kong's biggest crisis in decades is dead. Carrie Lam admitting the government's work on the bill has been a total failure. And the British government continues to insist the UK ambassador to the US has its full support. That despite Donald Trump saying the US will no longer work with him after he described Trump as inept and his White House as uniquely dysfunctional.